I am going to do a quick introduction here to our current speaker, Mr. Neumann Lim. So I'll give I'm going to give a quick biography, and then I'll give him just a quick intro from my side as well, because Neumann and I go way back. So Neumann's currently a senior manager at Deloitte. He leads development of services, strategy, methodologies on cyber detection and incident response. Prior to this, he spent several years working large enterprises, government specializing in incident response. He's got more than 14 years of infosec experience, delivered numerous cyber risk assessments, coordinated national incident response across multiple industries. And he's also been invited as a thought leader, many different conferences such as GrayHat BlueTeam Conf, DefCon Village, HTCIA Canada, Toronto CISO Summit and CCTX. Also mentioned that Neumann and I go quite way back. He was my mentor in the Cyber Olympics. That's going back like a lot of years now, like 7 years. Happy to say that he's also was the one who hired me at my current position and helped me get into the industry. So a lot of respect for him, and I'm really looking forward to your talk. So with that, Neumann, I'll let you take it over.
Hey, thanks, Stan. Yes, we do go back way back. Yeah, no, it's been a long time. I originally was part of the Vancouver scene, but I think the last 10 years I've been in Ontario. I just recently made the transition back to BC. So happy to be back in rainy Vancouver. But it is, like I said, I've always considered Vancouver home. So it's just me returning home, and I feel much better that way. That said, I am going to stop sharing my video here, and I'm going to start sharing my presentation. First and foremost, welcome to my talk. It's about operationalizing threat hunting for your enterprise. As you know, my name is Neumann Lim. I'm going to be giving the talk for today. So without further ado, I'll just pass this over to the next slide, which is the agenda for today. So I'm going to start with a quick introduction of myself. I know Stan has already introduced me, but there's a few more things from a contact perspective I'd like to quickly share. The next thing I want to go into is basically understanding what is threat hunting and why it's important for you to have a threat hunting operations, especially if you are a large enterprise. The second part to that is understanding what you need to have from a foundations perspective before you can start your threat hunting. So there has to be a little bit of maturity that occurs, as well as with any sort of what I call a scientific endeavor. There has to be a number of assumptions that have to be made ahead of time, as well as met some of those requirements. Next thing is that we need to understand as well is threat hunting is very heavily based on data and converting that data into intelligence. So we need to go through that life cycle of basically doing that, converting what data you have, whether it's on-prem, in your environment, or from an external source. Then we go through some of the methodologies, but before I go into the main methodologies, I want to take a quick break so that everybody can kind of digest that information before I move on. That's really when we start looking at the overall understanding of threat hunting. So that way, I'm going to show a number of frameworks that will simplify your life, followed by, again, applying the scientific method. And then we're going to start with something very simple, which is we basically start with a quick hunt on looking at IOCs. IOCs are probably the easiest ones that you can do. Then we're going to start looking at a little bit of, okay, well, how do you mature that into looking at hunting for TTPs? Last but not least, we're going to apply some science and mathematics to hunting the unknowns. And my last slide is basically about tying it all together, understanding all of the complex components that go into having a threat hunting operation for your enterprise. That said, so I am a senior manager at Deloitte. I do lead a number of services, predominantly in the incident response space. I do most of my work with government agencies. And of course, like Stan had mentioned previously, I've got a lot of experience, many years of experience, including speaking at multiple different types of security conferences, going back a number of years. So if you're interested in following me, I do have a standard LinkedIn pages. I do have a Twitter page where I post mostly malware analysis tweets, as well as share some cybersecurity information. I do collect quite a bit of data from Twitter. So I do a little bit of Twitter dumpster diving there. So if you do follow my Twitter account, you will find that it is largely on malware and incident response. All right, so without further ado, is everyone ready? We're gonna jump right into threat hunting. Perfect, okay. So we'll start with the quick definition of what is threat hunting, like trying to understand what that means, right? So realistically, threat hunting is really a proactive and intelligence-driven process, right? To basically search for threats by first and foremost understanding their behaviors, understanding what kind of tools they use, understanding their techniques and their procedures, right? And again, it's an intelligence-driven process, right? Just like how you would, if you were to go out and say, for example, hunt for an animal or hunt for food, there has to be some intelligence-driven, right? So you need to know where good hunting grounds are. You need to know what you're hunting for. Then you need to also understand what type of activities, behaviors that the prey that you're going after is going to be would have or would exhibit that will enhance your ability to hunt. That said, I need to take a quick step back to just make sure that everybody understands there is a difference between threat hunting and incident response. And not to get the two mixed, because it's very easy to do so. So really, threat hunting is more of a proactive approach, whereas incident response is definitely 100% reactive. So something bad has happened, you are reacting to it. Threat hunting is, in essence, you're going out there to prevent some of these things from happening in the first place. So that leads to the second point, which is it seeks to avoid future issues. Next, threat hunting requires quite a lot of maturity from a security detection perspective. So you need to meet a high threshold, or at least a good solid foundation in what I consider understanding your own internal data sources. And then last but not least, realistically looking at, in order for you to be very successful in your threat hunting operations, you're basically looking for unknown patterns within your data set. That is like the most important one, where you start to migrate into that space. So here's the difference between the two sets of, I would say, methodologies. I don't want people to be, what I consider, I don't want them to be confused between the two. And so here's a big difference. Being an incident responder, oftentimes a lot of people are always confused in the terminologies when I go into a response. Aren't you going to be hunting for the bad guy? I'm like, yeah, I am for a certain extent, but realistically, it's an incident response. I'm really hunting a very specific thing for this particular threat actor. I'm not proactively hunting for them. So going into the major assumptions, so I'm going to basically quote John Lambert here. The main reason why most threat operations or most threat hunting operations fail is because we think in a very traditional or classical way, right? So most defenders will think in lists. Here's a list of IOCs that I gotta go and look for. All right, great. That's not the be all and end all. And that's actually a very, very poor way of doing hunts. The key aspect here is this: most attackers, most red teams, most hackers, most ATPs will think in terms of graphs, right? They're looking at analysis, they're looking at links, looking at connections into various components of your enterprise, whether it's technology, people, or laxes in your process. So we need to start changing our mentality about this and start thinking in terms of these types of links, these types of connections in order for us to be successful. So that's our first major sort of assumption that we have to get right. So that said, there's also another assumption that we have to be mature. What does that look like? So realistically, we know from a maturity perspective for most organizations, yes, we have our policies. in place. So those are, I would say, very foundational. Having basic logging and security monitoring is also very important. So from a maturity perspective, you have to be at what I call a very high level of maturity before you can start to hunt. That said, it doesn't mean that you have to have all of the above before you would be, be able to start your hunt operations. What I'm trying to say is, in order for you to be successful, you would have to have all of these things in place first. You're going to find out very quickly, for example, if you do not use sysmon logs within your environment, you're going to find out very quickly that you have a large gap in your detection. So you're not going to be able to find some of the techniques that a threat, like an APT would be using, because you just don't have that visibility. So again, another assumption is that for threat hunting operations to be successful, you have to have a high level of maturity. So that said, what does that look like? So we're jumping into data sets. So in order for you to be successful, you need to have a lot of data, a lot of, I would say, in some cases, a lot of system technical data, right? So here's just a subset of some of the information that you would need to have and need to collect within your environment. And by collecting it, I mean not just collecting the logs and putting it somewhere, collecting the log and analyzing them. So you need to parse the data, you need to carve the data, you need to basically look at the information, connect them together, link it together, and analyze it so that you get some intelligence from it. Otherwise, a sea of data is just not going to help you. But first and foremost, you still need to have some of these within your environment. So data is important to have. Otherwise, if you don't have it, again, you can't fight what you can't see. And if you don't have data, you can't see what's happening within your environment. So one of the major things that I do come across most organizations is that there's just too much data. So how do we do that? How do we convert this sea of data into what I call intelligence? So first and foremost, threat intelligence is really the collection, the processing, the integration, and ultimately the analysis of all of the various different types of data that's coming into your environment, so that you can very quickly discern whether or not you have hostile threats or are a target for some of these bad actors. And that's really what threat intelligence is really all about. And how that distills downwards from a data perspective is going to be shown in my next slide. And basically, when you're looking at this, you're looking at the huge overwhelming number of amount of data, right? You need to distill that, convert some of that data into actionable information within your environment, right? Okay, so you've got a bunch of user logs. What does that user log tell me? Great, it's telling me that Bob logs in 9 to 5, and that's basically it. Awesome, great. Now I'm going to change that into, or convert that into intelligence. I understand that Bob has a user behavior of 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. Bob suddenly now logs in on a Sunday. Well, hang on a second. That's not normal. That tells me something that I need to action upon. And ultimately, at the end of the day, intelligence is really about, changing data into information that will allow you to make a decision. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of ones and zeros that reside on a storage device. So ultimately, at the end of the day, that information must tell you something. And from that information, you must be able to make a decision from it. And that's, I think, ultimately the key aspect of understanding and distilling what we have as a sea of data into information and ultimately into actionable intelligence. So that said, let's take a quick look at what are some of the sources of intelligence. And normally I would take a quick poll of the audience and basically ask them, what kind of intelligent data do you have coming into your environment? But since I'm going to hold off all of the questions until the end, I'm going to kind of run you through some of these examples. So first, we need to understand what type of intelligence we have that is available to us. So I've broken it down into basically 3 functional areas. One is technology intelligence, signals intelligence, and then open source intelligence. And this is then further broken down into 2 components. One is external data and one is internal data. And when you start combining them, you're going to start understanding sort of the insight into your threatscape. And that's extremely important by taking all three pillars, breaking all three pillars up into two components, then analyzing, collecting it all, analyzing it to then create your own threat profile in your own threat landscape. So typically what we see in most organizations, we're going to see things like external threat reports, right? And those external threat reports could be ones that are sent out by, say, government agencies. There are also some security vendors, such as Mandiant, such as Deloitte, that will put out some of this type of intelligence reports where we can consume that. And typically we consume those types of reports in an IOC format, right? So indicators of compromise, whether it's an IP address, domain address, a particular threat actor's technique or tool. So those are the types of what I would consider external sources of data. So this is just a couple of examples that we see in, like I said, the space that we have, the industry that we consume, right? So this brings us information into our environment from an external source. So now we take a look at what can we find internally, because at the end of the day, it's great to take all of those external sources and then apply that to, say, our perimeter defenses, apply that to, say, our internal monitoring. But what does that look like from an internal perspective? How can we utilize our own internal data so that we have that home team advantage? Because at the end of the day, we know ourselves better than the threat actors. They have to kind of fumble around in order for them to get to their target. So they're going to be fumbling around your environment, and you're going to use that to your advantage. So what does that look like from an internal source perspective? So let's take a look at some internal sources of data that we can utilize and convert that into intelligence. So where we want to look at is really look at number one, from a tech-in perspective, right? We have network telemetry. So understand that every attack has to cross the network in order for them to get into your system. So collecting all of that information, and I'm going to go quickly back to my previous slide here that shows the different sources. So looking at your network level sources, right? So all of these things, we're looking at firewall logs, proxy logs, DNS logs, IDS, snort logs, JA3, NetFlow, PCAP data, all of that network telemetry. We should be collecting that, analyzing that. That will give us some understanding of what is normal within our environment. Say, for example, we've got a DMZ. We know that there's a web application server in that DMZ. I can see the normal types of traffic that come in and out of that. That web application server is then connecting to an internal database. I know what type of traffic that's coming through there. I also know that there is specific ports that are open. I can monitor those for any sort of abnormal activity. Now, if somebody were to try to send a different, say, signal down to my internal database, maybe using a different port, that should stand out to me immediately as sort of, something that is suspicious that I can then go forth and do my investigations, and maybe even at that point in time trigger an incident from that. But the key aspect here is this: having that telemetry is extremely important. So first and foremost, understanding that we need to have that data and utilize that data so that we can increase our internal intelligence at that point in time.
And Neumann, can I ask a quick question there?
Yeah, sure.
In terms of, like, you go back to the data slide there, just quickly, what's the biggest blockers you found to getting those data sources?
So one is the lack of understanding what needs to be collected. Number two is the mass amount. So most confusions with most IT departments is, one, for example, they don't know that Sysmon is available to them. They can install it, configure it, and then start collecting that data. A lot of times other organizations also do not turn on the more advanced or enhanced auditing features. That may also be something, like I said, it's not in their licensing model, or they haven't applied a patch that will allow them to turn that on. So there are some technical hurdles, technical challenges to overcome before they do that. And then the next part is the sheer amount of information that needs to be distilled, right? So for example, turning on Sysmon in a raw configuration perspective is probably going to overwhelm most collectors. So you need to then go in and configure it correctly so that you're collecting information that you want to find that is specific to your environment, right? So if you have a bunch of SQL servers, great. You want to monitor for, say, SQL traffic or SQL activity from a trace log perspective. All the other stuff you probably don't want to turn on because that's just not going to give you any valuable information. So can you collect it? Yes, you can, but is it going to be useful for you? No, it's not. So you might want to uncheck those boxes when you're starting to do those configurations. It takes time to do that. And I think a lot of folks don't necessarily dedicate that time to go through all of those and to collect things that make sense for their organization. And also from a security perspective, yes, a lot of folks will configure things like Sysmon for, say, tracking and troubleshooting problems, but not utilize it for security.
Cool, thanks.
Okay, so let's go back to our next internal source of data, which is post telemetry. So this is something that, again, goes back to understanding what each individual system is doing, right? So for example, I've got the marketing folks. They're typically accessing, say, our share folder that would have all of the marketing materials, posters, images. They typically would have a file server that is accessible probably globally. So they'll have a file system, whether it's on the cloud or in the DMZ, where it allows them access from wherever they are in the world, because they need to have that, those images available very easily, very rapidly. So understanding that, say, this particular host would have both internal and external access points, understanding that the type of individuals that will be logging into this system is mostly on the marketing side. Now, if you suddenly start to detect things like, okay, well, hang on, why is the engineering department accessing, this file server, and why would they be doing that? Might trigger something, that would be a little bit odd for your team. So looking at some of that host telemetry makes a lot of sense, right? Understanding where that system connects to, how many systems it connects to, who are the users that it normally connects to as well, would provide you with a lot of actionable intelligence if you are going down that path. So first things first, let's go back to take a quick look at what some of that data sources will look like, right? So from a host telemetry perspective, we're looking at the event logs, we're looking at PowerShell logs, event tracing, syslogs for Linux systems, syslog for Mac OS. If you have, an EDR agent, the EDR agent does also collect a lot of that host telemetry. So collecting the logs from that would also help build some of that visibility. The key here is to then collect all that information so that you know what's happening on these hosts, and then build sort of a baseline so that you know what is good. And when evil shows up, you can easily detect evil. So the next one I think I touched a little bit on is user behavior. So again, why would engineering be connecting to a, marketing file server, right? And going back a little bit further to one of my earlier examples. So Bob, why is Bob logging in on a Sunday when he normally logs in Monday to Friday, 9 to 5? Well, maybe in Bob's case, he was on vacation and he had a very, important presentation that he needed to send out, and that would explain the Sunday log on, that he was away from the office. He had to log in on a Sunday. He had to complete his presentation and send it off. And all of that typically would, from a, like I said, from a security perspective, you would then approach the user or maybe look at some of the emails and find out really quickly that, oh, hang on, that was the reason why Bob logged in on a Sunday. Similarly, looking at what the engineering team is doing on a marketing server, that again, looking at that type of behavior, if it's abnormal, somebody from a security perspective should be asking those questions, right? So you need to be looking at, are you building these types of user behavior profiles to say, yes, this individual does this at this time. And if they don't do that, perhaps we need to question why. And like I said, it could very well be a legitimate answer to it. You know, important, urgent presentation needed to be delivered on a Sunday. That explains that particular activity. Now, again, if you don't have this, if you don't collect this information, then of course you would never be able to detect this. That abnormal behavior on a login on a Sunday would just kind of, you know, be, it would just be part of that giant data set of noise. You would never detect it. And then one of the other areas that I think is also very important to look at is also device profiles and their vulnerabilities. Because understanding that most threat actors, especially this year in 2021, we see so many threat actors exploiting vulnerabilities to gain access into corporations. So we need to understand all the different device profiles. Profiling of devices also makes very good sense. So if you're one of those organizations or enterprises that do have a particular vendor within your environment, say, for example, you have all Dell machines or all HP machines, which I think some of those large vendors do provide blanket coverage for devices. Great, because now you know the driver sets, you know the vulnerabilities if one particular model has a CVE, for example. You understand that where your security gaps are, you understand where your vulnerabilities are, and you can go and wrap some security around it. Or from a threat hunting perspective, that becomes intelligence for you to then go and look and hunt and see if someone or a threat actor is actively targeting those vulnerabilities. So that creates, like I said, an opportunity for you to go and look for these things. So that basically ends sort of where I want to talk about from a technology perspective. So yes, there are many other profiles and many other telemetries that you can collect internally, right? But these are just some of the examples for folks to start from a foundations perspective. Stan, do you have a question?
I was going to open the floor to find out if anybody else had a question.
Actually, I was thinking about.
I
was thinking about one thing. When you're collecting this data, I think items like NetFlow you have to be careful with, so you're not doubling and tripling up on the data. You have to make sure you're collecting the data at the correct points.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, so NetFlow is a very important one. So understanding collection of NetFlow data, as well as the conversations and sessions for each of those is very important. So you really want to amalgamate them at a single point if you can. Now, there's a reason why this is really geared at the enterprise who are, you know, like I said, getting to the point where they should be looking at threat hunting operations and looking at areas where they can start. So yes, you're 100% correct. Having a single point for where you can collect your NetFlow data is extremely important. Otherwise, you're going to start seeing duplicates, and you're going to see a lot of what I call duplicate conversations, duplicate sessions, and that creates problems for your hunters.
You know, one observation that I'll make from a few of the clients that I've dealt with, and Neumann, I'm not sure if you've had the same thing, but oftentimes just the first step of, there's been a number of clients that we've dealt with where they don't even know what they have out there to even collect anything. And they don't know their technology points, their asset, they don't have very good asset listing. That becomes sort of I've seen that as a step one issue oftentimes with some companies. It's like they don't even know where they get these things from, and it becomes for them to understand what they actually even have in their environment.
No, 100%. So under device profiles, so having an asset inventory makes a huge difference, right? And then having something like a CMDB that allows you to collect all of your vulnerabilities, your applications, your systems configurations, those can go a long way as well from a defense perspective. Again, it really goes back to the whole point of you can't fight what you can't see. So you need to have these data points in order for you to make those types of salient decisions. So without data, you know, I think we're stuck, you know, between a rock and a hard place, right? Yeah, I mean, ultimately, threat hunting, if you really distill it down, it's a data science problem. And like I said, that's one of the reasons why, as we go further into the threat hunting methodologies, you're going to see that there is scientific approaches to this, as well as a mathematical approach to it. The next area I want to talk about is signal. So again, at the enterprise level, it's easy to work well with some of your what I call your communications or telecom vendors. So a lot of the times, you know, the large players in the space, Bell, the Telesis, the Rogers, can feed you and provide you some signals intelligence, right? Giving you that information like, hey, we're monitoring this link for you. We could tell you, you know, whether or not something is happening, whether or not you're subject to, say, a DDoS attack. So that's actually a very important one, because again, in order for an APT or a bad person to gain access to your systems, they have to traverse a network. There's no if, ands, or buts about that one. In order for them to intrude, they have to cross the network layer. So we're not talking about physical attacks in this particular case, just the network components. So they have to go through that. And if you have good, strong partnerships, good intelligence sharing amongst your telecom vendors, that will provide data for you to then basically, like I said, hunt within that data set, or take some of those IOCs and apply it to some of your defensive controls. The next one I want to talk about, and this one again is an interesting one, because with our government agencies, and if you have some of their intelligence feeds, and in some cases, they also monitor your connections for you, they will be sending you some information using typically classified under the TLP protocols. And so you occasionally will receive like a TLP Amber signal from them, and they will provide information about what they see. And you can then take that information back into your own organization and, like I said, run a quick hunt to see if that is in fact true, or it's just something that is touching the surface and hasn't actually made it into your environment. So those signals are important to also have if you've got those relationships. Any questions around the two signals intelligence components? So Stan, I got a quick question for the group here, which is, are people familiar with sticks and taxi?
That's a good question. How many people are familiar? There is a question in, I'll wait for people to, I know it's integral into my industry, so I'm very familiar with it. But there are others that may not be so familiar with it.
Okay. Well, I can just briefly explain what sticks and taxi is. So it's basically a protocol and a framework to allow the sharing of intelligence using the sticks format. Sticks is basically I would say it's an XML format, more or less, that allows us to basically share information very quickly. So they are what we call lighthouses or beaconing type applications and software that our government agencies, our lettered agencies utilize to then share that information with the appropriate partners. So if you're part of those channels, it's a fantastic way to share information back and forth securely, as well as to share threat information across. So if you're familiar with sticks and taxi, highly recommend that you take a quick look at it and basically build some foundational ability in the in basically being able to accept sticks transmissions as well as send it out. The last source of information or intelligence, I like to say, is again going back to the what we call open source. I say open source in quotation marks because a lot of these groups are at the enterprise level are fairly closed. It's only amongst ourselves, right? So it would, while it's open to anyone in our industry, it is not it's not for the global public. So it's not as open source as we would like it to be. So things like ISACs, for example, where the industry groups come together and share information across that industry group. So for example, the FS ISAC, for example, would be sharing a lot of that financial information data across. If there are any threats that are targeting that particular industry, that information or that intelligence is then distilled down to all of the partners in that industry. Again, probably one of the underlying technologies they're using is STIX and TAXI in that particular ISAC. But again, there may be other ways of them disseminating that information. That said, there are also closed industry groups. Some of the think tanks, some of the other more exclusive groups do have some of that information that is typically available as part of a membership. And last but not least, and this is one I would say it's more truly on an open source perspective. One is the peers in the security peers in our industry, as well as the other security researchers. So as you start to network with your peers, your security peers and the security researchers, you're going to start to realize that threat information sharing is quite open amongst, I guess, known or trusted security researchers. They would basically, if you sign up to, say, for example, my Twitter, you're going to see a lot of information about like the latest malware, or there are new samples that just came out, and security researchers have already analyzed it and started sending out their IOCs based on their analysis. And then, of course, other threat researchers will then take a quick look at that information and then add to the intelligence behind it. Yes, that technique, we've seen it before. This other group also uses it. So those are the areas, again, from another intelligence perspective, we can also collect that information. So using tools like Meltigo, for example, we can start to collect information from some of these closed groups, from some of these security researchers, and automatically start to populate a database so that you can collect some of this open source intelligence so that it feeds into your own security program or your threat hunting program. So for example, if a security researcher finds that, hey, this new piece of malware is using this particular exploit, then you can then take that technique or that exploit and go back to your environment and say, hey, has anyone seen signs of this in my environment? Is there a log somewhere that tells me someone is using this against my environment? Or am I vulnerable because I looked at my vulnerabilities management list and say, yep, is some of my systems here a target for this? So that would be very, very interesting and a very good way of collecting that open intel and then applying that to your own organization. That's it. I will open up the channel to the audience for one last round of quick questions. I'm not seeing the chat, but if somebody can.
I've been following. Yeah, I've been following the chat here. So yeah, Fred linked like a malware information sharing platform. MISP. Yeah, MISP is another one.
Yeah, MISP is a good one. Yeah.
Well, being part of the MSISAC, which down here is the multi-state one for state, local, territorial, and tribal information sharing. They've been very useful and very helpful as far as, not only sharing information, but being a platform to share information. And they've also helped us out when we had a suspected incident.
Yeah. It also extremely expedites the time in which you can basically narrow down what to look for. Say, for example, your threat hunt, say, confirms, yes, someone has been exploiting this vulnerability. And one of my systems is vulnerable to it. And most likely because it's been exploited on that system, they've gotten an entry point. From that, you then pivot that into a incident response. Then immediately from that threat intel feeds, all the different researchers are mentioning all of these things and all of the IOCs. You can basically take the IOCs, copy and paste that and basically run it in that box and see if you get a hit, right? And that really expedites your confirmation of whether or not, yes, this is an incident, this is an actual security incident that needs to, bring all hands on board. And that really helps you, like I said, that information sharing, that intelligence that we can collect from outside of our environment, and then bringing it into the inside.
Any other questions before we take I take this is your break point, Neumann?
It is. We are going to take a break before, so we just talked mostly about intelligence and how to, like I said, distill data into intelligence. So formulating all of those intelligent points, and then coming up with the ability to then action upon those. So realistically, the last thing I want to kind of go into with everybody is it's understanding the pros and cons of this, right? Understanding why it makes sense for you to go down this path. So the pro is, the ability for you to see what's happening, not just internally, but externally as well. And then also the second part to that is looking at how you can then expedite some of your own actions, right? Giving you that decision-making capability. So if you had the intelligence coming in, you can make a decision on it. And then the cons to this is it expensive? Yes, because you're collecting a lot of data. Is it going to be intensive from a processing perspective? I would say yes, because it requires a lot of man hours. Machine learning was going to help narrow that down quite a bit. AI is going to help narrow that down quite a bit. But as you know, both of those things are kind of in its infancy at this point, especially AI is kind of getting there. It's not quite there yet. So we need to spend a lot of time and a lot of engineering on that. Is it going to be valuable? Absolutely. I mean, that's my opinion on it.
Have you seen any good examples of ML implementations?
Yeah, I've seen quite a few really good ones. Here at Deloitte, we do have an AI project that we're working on very heavily, and it has a lot to do with taking what we've learned from the machine learning components and then applying that into an intelligent learning model.
Okay. Why don't we take a break for 15 minutes? Does that work for you, Neumann?
That works for me. Yeah.
Perfect. How many people have actually heard of or used Sticks and Taxi, Tom? So if you've never heard of Sticks and Taxi, it's a format for disseminating threat intelligence in like a feed source. So it actually is far easier for a machine to read it. And it's an open source standard.
Hey, Stan, I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Thanks. Saves me. I'm just trying to look it up, but you probably have it easier. There you go. Link should be there for you, Tom. Yeah, and medium.com. Thanks, Vivek. It came out quite a number of years ago. Let's see, I kind of missed this data. Yes, Ray, largely without human intervention. It makes it a lot easier for different platforms to ingest and disseminate the data.
It does.
I've never heard of it through Sticks and Taxi yet, but maybe Neumann might have a better idea on that one.
Yeah, so it does. Basically, any system that you open up for any communications will provide an avenue of attack. Now, because of the format in which Sticks and Taxi works, it's basically glorified XML. The attack surface is minimal to like almost nothing. So can they break into that box? Yes, but they will typically not. They wouldn't be doing it through Sticks and Taxi. They would be doing it through a vulnerability at the OS network or some other layer. Yeah, but that said, hijacking a taxi server would be very interesting.
I've actually never. It would actually, because it's a pretty popular feed.
Yeah, think about the chaos you can create if you hijack a taxi server.
Yeah.
If you took over, let's say, the CSE taxi server and you start, I mean, what happened at the FBI? Just the mail server, getting compromised, having a threat actor control and send out, emails from that server. Imagine taking control of, say, the FBI's taxi server and then sending out
false reports.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I don't know if it would have less to do with legit stuff being poisoned, Ray, as to more saying falsifying bad stuff. In other words, you could essentially falsify a feed to, oh, you could wreak some pretty good chaos by falsifying certain data. Wow, it's Friday, I can't talk anymore. But yeah, it is a very, very popular medium. It wasn't so much when it first came out, but it gathered steam pretty quickly over the course of a year.
Is there would
Yeah,
there
go ahead,
be
Jerry.
would there be any precedent, say, like the FBI or some organization, sends out, okay, XYZ is bad, but then the malicious actors send out a 6 feed saying XYZ is good? Is there a way when there's a conflict that it would resolve itself?
Yeah, so within the sticks format, there's a way to add confidence level based on your organization or industry. So there's a lot of feeds that will come in and it has absolutely no relevancy to your organization. You would drop that confidence or scoring down to almost nothing. Have people poisoned the feed in the past before? Yes, they have. And that's one of the reasons why the sticks format keeps changing and keeps getting better, is exactly because of this. So I think in 2.1, they added a new field to allow old intel to expire automatically. So you're not going to keep seeing the old stuff keep coming back in. So that's actually really helpful. So like I said, it's a constantly growing and like I said, it keeps getting better with time.
There's a lot of technologies that use it as well. Like Anomaly is a heavy supporter. There's an awful lot of because actually most SIM products and others are now starting to incorporate it as mechanisms for pushing data into their systems.
So my caveat to everyone is this: yes, you're going to get a lot of data when you do have a sticks feed coming in. Just make sure that you spend the time to curate it. Remember, treat it like data. It's unadulterated data that needs human eyes on it at the very beginning. So you need to go spend the time, go through it, convert that data into actual intelligence for your org. That's very, very important. I cannot stress that enough.
I'm sure, right to your point, that it's becoming ubiquitous. It is. I'm positive it's getting looked at. I mean, come on, in this day and age, they're looking at every avenue. So I'd agree with that 100%. Alrighty, 3:15, Mr. Lim, I think I'll let you take over for the second half of the presentation.
Thank you. Welcome back. Normally I would ask for a round of hands or to see if everyone's back, but I'll take everyone's word. It's Friday after all, so hopefully everyone will spend the rest of their afternoon being a bit more relaxed and take it from there, and then enjoy the weekend as it comes along. All right, so this is the toughest part of my talk, is really getting into the threat hunting operations and then really getting that road started. It's really a journey, just so you know. So I'll kind of ease you in there first with some of the theory behind it, and then we'll start looking into, okay, well, how do you make your first hunt? All right, so the first one I want to go through just very quickly is, again, how do you get your people to look at the data, distill it, and then turn it into actionable, or what we use today in the form of IOCs, right? So once we've distilled all that data down, the simplest and easiest format is IOCs. So number one, IOCs can form basically the start point of a hunt. As you can see, external sources giving you that IOC, you can then copy and paste that and apply that to your hunt, as well as copy and paste it and apply that to your perimeter controls. Those are extremely useful. However, if you're starting from internally, for example, understanding your own environment, doing the research and analysis within your own environment and your own data sets, generating your own IOCs, that's going to be an interesting one. And then applying those IOCs in your search, to find things and to hunt for them proactively. Just because you don't see it today doesn't mean it's not going to show up tomorrow, right? So for example, if I took an IOC that I've generated, whether I created a Sigma rule so that I can keep applying it over and over again as a search query, or a Yara rule for more on the network side of things. And then again, similarly, applying that query over and over again just to see if I get a hit on it. Like I said, just because it doesn't occur today, it doesn't mean that it won't show up, 2 hours later or a week later. It can yield, like I said, some very good, interesting findings within your environment. And then last but not least, all of these things, all of this behavioral, this pattern making process really should be generating or converting it into some sort of an actionable and some sort of a sustainable defense. So I did mention two very key words, Sigma rules and Yara rules. So as you start to build your own database of IOCs, you really want to look at automating some of this by writing your own Sigma and writing your own Yara rules. Then you can turn this into more of a sustainable query over time, right? So you can start to automate some of this. All right, so what does that really look like? When we look at breaking down the different types of IOCs that you can generate yourself, as well as what you can also collect from external sources. All right, so everybody knows the pyramid of pain. I'm sure you've seen this many times over at many different security conferences. We understand the pyramid of pain. We know that at the very bottom, when we're looking at hash values, IP addresses, domain names, these is what I would consider atomic or ephemeral. These are the simplest forms of IOCs that you can intake, right? And again, as you can see, simple, easy, and trivial. No problem, easy peasy. You start going down the middle of this pyramid to the very tippy top, you're now starting to see things as causing additional complexities and making things a little bit harder for you when you now need to then build that into a threat hunt or organizing your threat hunt or preparing for your threat hunts, because they are ultimately a lot harder to, I would say, decipher, to collect, to be able to get to the kind of the meat of it. So one, understanding host artifacts, right? So taking a look at a memory dump and then looking at the artifacts or the processes, the process names in that memory dump and applying that to, say, your entire environment, then that may be a little bit harder. Now, if you can obviously write a Sigma rule for that, that'd be great. That makes it a lot easier. But getting to that point and collecting that information is annoying. It's simply annoying. Going to a server and doing a memory dump, it's got 32 gigs of RAM. That might take a while. Some servers have a lot more RAM than 32 gigs. I was looking at my own laptop here. My apologies. Say you have to dump 128 gigs of RAM and analyzing that, say even in volatility, that's going to take a long time. So it's not easy, it's not simple, it's a little bit annoying. Going up to the tool level. So this is one where we look at the different applications that are run and then also looking at what the threat actors are using. So we're now looking at distilling threat actor tools. Do they live off the LAN tools? So some of these live off the LAN tools are the very same tools that your own IT staff are using. Is it challenging to differentiate between what your own internal teams are using? Yes. Is it challenging to say that one tool that you use in-house is also being leveraged by an APT? Yes, because you don't know the context behind it. That makes it a lot more challenging. What we can do is basically put some time differentiators in place where you have your IT administrators say, these are just-in-time actions. We're going to use these tools just in time. They are approved. We know about them and we track all of that. Is that challenging? Absolutely. I have not seen too many organizations that go down that path. where every tool, every application that an administrator uses in-house is tracked right down to the time. That is challenging, extremely challenging. So getting to that point is very difficult. Now then, of course, taking a look at what the threat actors are using. So understanding the more unique tools that they use, right? So what kind of, say, C# binaries are they utilizing? Do you use that within your own environment? If you have a developer pool, yeah, good luck. Chances are they will be using .NET frameworks, C# frameworks, DevOps, all types of tools that would be pretty much similar to that of a threat actor. If you don't have a dev pool, okay, great. When you do see, say, for example, .NET framework, building or executing or compiling code, that may make it a little bit easier for your team to detect. That said, again, one of the major reasons why this part is very challenging, or at least this part of the pyramid is challenging, is exactly that. A lot of the common tools that we have, a lot of the frameworks we use today are also leveraged by threat actors. That's why it's challenging to kind of decipher and differentiate between those legitimate activities and those of malicious activities. Those, like I said, tough. Then the very last part is this, the TTPs. So all those techniques, I've already alluded to some of them, like the TTPs that the threat actors are using, those techniques, very simply put, are very common to also your own teams. Those are difficult to actually decipher. And that's why it's so tough to get to the very bottom of this. Can you monitor the tools and application usage? Yes, you can. Do most people do it? No, they don't. Going back into then the techniques and procedures of those APTs and threat actors, that makes it even tougher. That exacerbates the problem even more, because a lot of the tools they use are the same tools we use. A lot of the techniques they use are also the same techniques that a DBA or system administrator would use. Where they start to deviate is where you should be really looking for, right? So those outlying activities, those outlying tools that they use, those outlining techniques are the ones that you should very quickly be able to immediately detect and notify and alert and start your hunt and start your incident response. So that said, now you've seen the paradigm pane. How do you go about organizing all of this into a threat hunting operation? How do you organize this? So I would first refer you to this threat hunt methodology, and this is the SANS threat hunt methodology. I think it was first developed by Andreas, one of the SANS instructors, and I believe there's a number of individuals that have now contributed to this threat hunting methodology. So it's a very simple methodology, right? First, you start with a purpose, right? So why are you threat hunting? What is the purpose behind it? Put some documentation around it. Second part is you need to scope out your hunt, right? So what areas of the hunt are you targeting today? How are you scoping it? What is in scope? What is out of scope? And of course, what sort of hypotheses are you validating or invalidating today? Remember, this is going to be an operational threat hunt, which means you're going to be running multiple threat hunts per day. And they will be targeting very many different things, including different threat actor, tools, techniques, and procedures. Third part to that is what data sources and tools are required for you to do your hunt. So for example, if you're looking at something that resides at the host level, what host data sources would you be tapping into to allow you to get the right visibility so that you can validate or invalidate your hypothesis? So that's actually a very important one. The fourth one is really sort of a management step where you need to review the entire plan. Does it meet the requirements? If it does, proceed. If it doesn't, then you need to take a step back and say, okay, so what requirements do I need? So then it goes back to what I mentioned earlier about the maturity, right? For example, you're going to review your threat hunting plan and you're going to realize I don't have a data source, or I am missing a tool that gives me the visibility to do this hunt. How do I go about collecting or getting that information? So standard enterprise procedures follows. You put a change request in, change management, it goes through the change management process. Tools, visibilities, logs, configurations get changed. Then you have the capability to meet the requirements of your hunt. Then you come back and continue this hunt. That's what I mean by, even if you don't get your threat hunting operations done, or these, you don't have the right requirements, still go through that process, because you're going to identify things that you don't have, and you can build towards it. Of course, the fifth step, very simple. If everything meets all the requirements, you conduct your hunt. You start the hunt, hypothesis validated or hypothesis invalidated. Then you go back to a feedback loop where you do the lessons learned, what went well, what didn't go so well during your threat hunting operations, and then you come back with, what can I improve? So it's a cycle, just like everything else. I think this is a very good methodology. Highly recommend everyone take a look at the SANS document around this. And I will put that in the chat window once I am completed this presentation. Okay, so we've all seen the pyramid of pain. Now we're going to go into what I consider the threat hunting pyramid. It's not the pyramid of pain. So it's a little bit easier. So again, it's combining a lot of that items. So it's basically looking at the anomaly components, looking at behavioral components, and then looking at atomic components. And why I've broken it up into these three pillars is basically to help organize your hunts a little bit better, makes things a little bit easier. Can you start hunting for atomic items right away? Absolutely, yes. Because from an IOC perspective, all you have to do is search for the latest, Mandiant report, latest FBI report, pull those IOCs out from that report, and you can already start to build a hunt around those. That's the easiest one that you can definitely go for. The middle one, where I call the behavioral aspects, I would say it's a little bit harder to get to. It would revolve, a little bit of maturity and visibility from your organization to be able to see all of those things, run through the methodology to make sure that you have the right tools and visibility and data sources before you can identify TTPs. It's a little bit tougher to get to, and it's very behavioral based. So you have to have those baselines already set up ahead of time. And then you can now look for some of the deviations from that. The last one is looking really at abnormalities. So this is the toughest one for most organizations. And I would say even seasoned threat hunters stumble quite a bit on the hunting for unknowns. If we were so good at hunting for unknowns, then there will be absolutely no threat actor that could hide from us. So this is one where I think if you struggle, that's fine. It's normal. Don't feel bad about it. Even the toughest people, the best experts in the world are stumbling on it. If we had a solution for this today, there will be pretty much no attacks because we would find them. So we're basically today, we're residing largely in behavioral aspects of hunting and creeping a little bit more into abnormalities, looking for abnormalities or the unknowns. So this is just my model for breaking up, like I said, the hunt, helping you kind of understand where you would want to go, and also making sure that you have the right technology and maturity level before you kind of jump into it. So that's it. Let's take a quick look at what frameworks. These are already established frameworks that can help you, guide you, model some of your own threat hunting models in your own environment, right? So the first one I want to take a look at is really the diamond model. Very simple. The diamond model has been around for a while. And you can basically break it up into 4 different areas, right? So understanding your adversary, understanding their infrastructure, your infrastructure, understanding their targets, and then knowing what the threat actors' capabilities are. So looking at some of their tools, some of their techniques. So this is an interesting model. There are some good takeaways from this, right? So one, the diamond model really helps you identify who your attackers are. So understanding it from their perspective, the adversary's perspective, understanding their infrastructure, understanding the capabilities that they can bring to bear against you. And then finally, understanding who the victim or what their target is. Ultimately, this is a very unique and good model to start. I would say if you do start with this one, it's actually one that would probably be a very good starting model. Ultimately, you want to basically come away with building a very good database on your adversaries and formulating a fairly good threat landscape for your enterprise. Now, I think one of the major takeaways from this, that from this model alone, you would have a very good database of who is potentially targeting you and what they can do against your environment. So that's one takeaway. One very quick question. Anybody here is familiar with the diamond model and are using it today as part of their threat hunting operations? You can just say yes in the chat or feel free to chime.
Not so much the diamond model, but on the TTP side for sure.
Okay, great. Like I said, this is just one framework that you can utilize, right? It's just one of those. I think the one that most people are familiar with is the ones that I'm going to be starting to go down the path of. So I'll just switch over to the next slide. So the other models, other frameworks that we can utilize are the kill chain and the MITRE attack. So these ones really target at the techniques and the procedures of all of these threat actors. Again, a very threat actor centric framework. Understanding what they do, their actions within their behaviors, and also ultimately from a MITRE perspective, also looking at all of their tools. So that's actually a really important one I would like to see people kind of utilize. The MITRE attack framework has built out a lot of intelligence around threat actor activity as well as their tool sets. So understanding tools that they use is very important, because if you don't use those tools in your own environment, that should be an alert. You need to convert those immediately into actions and say, yep, that one definitely, if I see it in my environment, very likely that's an incident. That's it. I would say use the kill chain, because if you see the kill chain and how it breaks up into what is MITRE today, you can see there's almost a link between the two of them. They are very similar. In fact, the MITRE attack framework is built based on the kill chain. So you can see that there's lots of similarities between there. So if you want to kind of simplify some of your threat hunting models, you can just jump right into sort of the kill chain and just use that from a higher level perspective. And then eventually migrating it into the MITRE attack, where there are so many different areas that breaks it even further down. So any questions on the different frameworks that you could potentially utilize? All right, I see some.
I was going to say, out of all the ones that you've worked with, Neumann, which one do you think is the easiest?
Easiest, I would say, is the kill chain, because it's just basically seven areas that you need to look forward to, and it's easy to do hunts for recon activity. It's also easy to do hunts for command and control, and then kind of go down those paths. All right, so in that case, I will just continue moving on. So the next step I want to say is, because threat hunting is really a very procedurally heavy activity, you really want to put some kind of a method behind it, right? So I would say 100%, like, use the scientific method for your threat hunting. So start by formulating a hypothesis, right? And then basically put together whether or not this hypothesis or the conditions in which this hypothesis is going to be true. Conduct your hunt or conduct your experiment as per the scientific model. Prove whether or not your hypothesis is correct. If it's correct, right? I mean, obviously, if it's correct, then obviously you probably have a security incident, then you want to start your incident response. If it's not correct, then go back and say, well, hang on, is there something here that I need to look at? Do I have the right data sources to be able to, confirm my hypothesis? Or in all absence of any other, data, my hypothesis is in fact proven wrong. I don't have this, but how can I automate it so that I can keep checking for this, so that I don't have to continue doing this from a manual perspective? So looking at this and doing this into a sort of a cycle and automated fashion is probably one of the major areas that you want to get into. So automate as much as you can, because like I said, every day, if you operationalize this, you should be doing multiple hunts per day. You should be looking for many different areas, many different things, many different threat actors over and over again. All right. Any questions for the scientific model? I think this is pretty straightforward. Okay, we shall continue. So I want to do a quick example for hunting for IOCs. This is one of the easiest ones, right? So where would you find your IOC? So say, for example, you took the FBI, one of the FBI reports. Usually at the very end of that report, you're going to see they have provided a list of IOCs. This list of IOCs consists of file hashes, IP addresses, domains in particular, that may be alluding to some of the threat activities for this particular APT or this particular, say, criminal group.
Hey, Neumann, can I pause you for a second?
Sure.
There's a question just in the chat. How do you evaluate whether you are doing enough threat hunting, especially when there's no breach or incident?
That is a very good one. Okay, so KPIs for threat hunting is it's something that's going to be difficult. So what you want to do is you want to be able to provide information on the types of hunts that you're doing and what they are achieving. So what is the objective for each of your hunts? Is there an enough threat hunting component? I don't think there is. I think what you want to show is coverage. How far down the line have you covered? Say, for example, have I covered FIN7 today? And all of the tools that they use and all of the activities that they are known for. Is that good enough for your organization? It depends. It depends on whether or not FIN7 is actively targeting your organization. So KPIs for threat hunting is a tough one. I would say it's difficult to measure. I would say the best way to measure it is by coverage. What have I covered today? If I'm in the financial sector, I want to basically target all of the fin groups, right? Because I know that they could potentially target me. So I want to basically say I'm hunting for all of their activities. I'm also hunting for all of the tools that they use and all their techniques. I want to make sure I have that covered. And then I start looking at some of the more outliers, some of the more difficult things to look for. Things like I said, things like maybe some newer tools or the transition from traditional C# attack tools to Golang tools. And then looking for, let's say, for example, some of the Golang binaries and see if there's any artifacts that I can find. So yes, there's no real answer to that, unfortunately. It's really a depends. But I would say use coverage as a starting ground. Say cover as much of it as you can. Provide the proof that you've covered all of these, and like I said, collect that information to start. Yeah, does that answer your question there? Hopefully that did it. I know sometimes like building the rationale and the KPIs around threat hunting is tough because it's hard to say that, you go to your leadership and say, hey, look, I've done 100 threat hunts today. We found nothing, and that could be a result that you will see for about 364 days, and then on the last day of the year you get a hit. But that may be a difficult one to tell your leadership. Say, look, we spent this much money and all of this effort, and we only got one hit per year. Yeah, it really depends. So work on coverage, and that way you can say we've covered all of these aspects. So make it look like it's more of a regular compliance checks. Like we've checked for all of these folks and we didn't find any of their activities, which is good. But if we do find their activities, we pushed it into incident response. Okay, so back to hunting for IOCs. And I think this is, like I said, a fairly simple one because these are ephemeral. So we take a look at the IOCs, we filter it down into two different areas. One is whether it's a host IOC or a network IOC. Then we take a look at those host-based IOCs and kind of break it up into, are these logs, are they hits on logs? Are they hits on host artifacts? For example, looking at some of the criminal groups and the ransomware. So are there any artifacts that point us towards file hash hits? Are there any, like I said, artifacts that point us to the malware or malware related activity? So things like, running Mimikatz, doing a dump on credentials or memory. And then of course, exfiltrating that credentials to another, like a Dropbox or something that isn't normally used in your corporation that will then trigger something a little bit more serious on your end. Similarly with the network components as well, looking at the infrastructure, does this infrastructure or these, the IPs or domains, are these normally things that your users or your team or your organization would connect to? Understanding whether or not there are some feeds that are coming in from your three-lettered agencies saying, hey, we spotted this activity or this IP address connecting to one of your hosts. Are there any observables from that? And then beginning, like I said, to look for those within your environment and then hunting it down and providing, like I said, some sort of action upon it, whether it's quarantining a device, blocking it at the network level, and so on. So hunting for IOCs, I would say, is the easiest one that you can go pretty much right away. And you can split it up by host IOCs or network IOCs, or you can do it concurrently depending on the size of your team. All right, so the next one I want to jump into is one where we're going to use an example from the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and we're going to go through it by looking at some of these very interesting ways that you can take a look at how we can hunt for a TTP, for example. So this is one we all have probably experienced much earlier this year, and that is the SolarWinds attack. So utilizing T1132, which is data encoding, base 32, not base 64, it's base 32, to look at this. So how this particular threat actor was detected, like I said, this was from one of the security researchers who posted their technique on Twitter. Looking at that particular example, we see this long string that they use to encode what we consider their victim. It's base 32. One of the main areas, or at least one of the ways to detect for this is using entropy, right? So when you look at this string of numbers, you run it through an entropy detector. The first thing you're going to find out is that, oh, hang on a second. This is not random. There is method to this. This is not something that is generated because somebody ran this through a randomizer. No, there is something behind this. So when you run entropy on this long string, it realizes that, hang on a second, there's something here. Decoding this, and of course, the security researchers were able to decode it using base 32. And they came up with the result of City of Kingston. Right, so now we know, based on this string, that you've got a target. So this is just one of the examples of one area where you can utilize some mathematical statistical analysis to basically help you hunt for specific items. Can you look for base 32 strings in your environment today? So how many of you do look for those types of strings in your environment? Not base 64, base 32. Can you conduct a hunt for that? Would it be easy? So think of this at the network layer. Network layer is not so bad, right? So you can see all of the domains coming in and out of your system. That's not a difficult one. Dump all your proxy logs, dump your firewall logs. Take a look, run a string search, collect all the garbly group strings, check for base 32 encoding, decode, and see if it makes sense. On the host, on the other hand, that would be a little bit more difficult, wouldn't it? How would you be able to find this type of a string within your environment on the host level? Anyone have any suggestions, any ideas? At the very bottom of this slide, you'll see there is there's a hint. Anyone here use Splunk? I'm not just calling out Splunk's name right here, but I think most SIMs have the ability to run something called Shannon entropy. or at least a Shannon entropy detection. So if you're using Splunk, and the reason why I call Splunk out is because I've used Splunk in the past to run this type of an entropy search, and I know it works. So that's one of the reasons why I'm calling it out. So there is an ability in Splunk or an add-on in Splunk to do an entropy search, and they use Shannon entropy for this. So if you have that particular add-on, you're going to be able to tell right away that there is some, there's low randomness about some of these strings, and it will give you a score, basically up to 1, and it will tell you whether or not this is a completely random string or something that is encoded. And then you can run your standard analysis on the string itself, decode it, and once you decode it, you should be able to find out whether or not it makes any sense or it is complete garbage. Okay, so that's just one example. So obviously we can do the same for base64, and base64, you're going to find a lot of things. A lot of threat actors use base64 encoding. Similarly, you can take another T out of the MITRE attack, and you can build a hunt just around that as well. So this is one of those, just a very simple example. Obviously, there are thousands of MITRE attack techniques that you can go through, and you can build a hunt for. Right, we're all good on that one? Okay. So this is just a bit of a joke, and it just kind of lightens things up a little bit. And it's really true. If you're into the malware space, you understand this very much so. You don't always decrease entropy, but when you do, it's usually an open system. Because when you look at it from a threat actor's perspective, right, I don't need to hide things if your system is wide open. I can be as open as I want. So the second question is, yes, you came here for a threat hunting class, but not really a math class, but really sorry about that. We are applying, like I said, some of the scientific method to this, as well as mathematics. So the next slide, we're going to go into a little bit of stats.
Question here, Neumann, just from Adam. This is like, there are many ways to identify base64 encoding. Are there ways to identify base32 by looking at it?
No, there's no way to just looking at it. It's difficult because it's an encoding methodology. It's not as easy as, you see the double equals at the very end, right? It's not like that. So you have to run it through the Shannon entropy tool.
Thanks, Neumann.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so hunting for unknowns. So now we're starting to get into the statistical analysis component. So if you take a quick look at the slide on the very far left here, you see this is the standard bell curve. And I know it's, if you're a statistician, you don't like to call it the bell curve. It's the 68, 95, 97, 99.7 curve. What I really want you to identify when we're hunting for unknowns is, one, leverage the home team advantage. You should know your environment up to the 95 percentile, right? Is it easy to do? No, it's not. I would say it's very difficult, but if you have the 95 percentile, detecting the 2.1% on either side, it's going to be a lot easier, right? And very simply put, understanding some of this is mostly pattern recognition. So what does that look like, right? So when you take a look at, say, for example, some of your Palo Alto logs or firewall logs, you see your baseline. Everything is fairly low, and then all of a sudden you see this giant spike in information or spike in data. What is this? That should be an investigation right there, right? Similarly as well, when you're looking at user agent anomalies, understanding what you have is normal within your own home team. You know what users, what applications, what cell phones they use. It's easy to say, yes, all of this makes a lot of sense. Hang on a second. Who is using curl? Who is using Python requests? That typically should stick out like a sore thumb. Now, what other user agents here is sticking out like a sore thumb, and why? Can anyone tell me? Any guesses? No? Who here still uses a Windows phone?
Maybe that's why.
So you see the second line here, there's Windows Phone OS. I mean, that in itself is already weird, right? So understanding your own environment. So as of today, there should be pretty much no one using a Windows Phone. Everyone will be either on an Android platform or an iOS platform. And of course, those have their own specific user agents. Seeing a Windows Phone like this should be cause of concern. Especially if you are looking at a log that is, or at least if you're hunting in the user agent space. Last but not least, now we take a look at living off the LAN binaries. So who here has seen a detection for bits admin? Yes, in some commands.
Yes, some commands.
Yes. Now, bits admin is a fairly old protocol, as we all know, right? I mean, 10 years ago, we probably see a lot of it because it was heavily leveraged by Microsoft, and Microsoft used it for pretty much everything that involves Windows updates, Windows systems, application updates, that sort of thing. Today, it's not necessarily used very much. However, a lot of threat actors utilize it because it still exists in the Windows environment. So are people in organizations monitoring for its use today? Yes, Conti, yes, 100%. Yes. Yes, we've seen Fin7 use bits admin as well. Yeah, Conti, absolutely. So that's what I mean by a lot of new threat actors are utilizing it too, because they realize that this particular application is already in your system and it's already whitelisted. So why not use it? So here's what I mean by really hunting for the unknowns, right? So are you using it today? Do you have the proper baselines? Can you see this activity? If you can then create, like I said, queries. Whether it's a Sigma rule, whether it's a Yara rule, whether it's a manual query in Splunk, in Logarithm, in whatever sim of your flavor, or regex, can you be looking for this type of activity? If you can, great. You're well on your way to having your own threat hunting operation and starting to build some processes around it. Because at the end of the day, you need to start looking at a methodology behind it, applying some standard, some standardization, basically putting some method to the madness, as I would like to call it, utilizing some of the statistical analysis that you can use for this, and then building, like I said, KPIs, going down the path of building a sustainable and automated threat hunting operation. So that's really, I think, at the end of the day, where everyone should be aiming towards. So if you don't have threat hunting operations today, I hope this talk really helps guide you or gives you that foundation so that you can go forth and start to look at this internally, start to build the capability, start to build the visibility, start to collect the data that you need to begin, like I said, some simple hunts, and then expanding that into the more difficult and more complex and more meaningful hunts. Because at the end of the day, if you can detect a new attack which nobody else has seen before, like a new Golang binary showing up in your environment, you would be ahead of the game. You would have prevented yourself from a security incident. And I know that we're not doing that today. A lot of organizations are not doing that today, and that's one of the reasons why we fall behind. So in order for us to be ahead of the attackers, to start to play on the same level that they are, we need to go down this path. All right, so my last slide is really about tying it all together. Right, so what does it look like? First and foremost, from a hunt perspective, right? So when you have the methodology and the framework and the scientific method, you're adhering to it, you're looking at your statistical models, you're using, like an XYZ statistical models, whether it's a standard bell curve, whether it's using the entropy, you're looking at regression, understanding all of those, then you take a look at, okay, I'm going to build my hypothesis, right? I'm going to create a hypothesis. Is this threat actor in my environment? Why and how? How do I go about validating if this is true or not? So I hunt for it. I hunt and I validate the hypothesis. And then what is really important from an unknown perspective is knowing what is already in your environment. So knowing the good, knowing what is in your environment, having those baselines. Leverage that home team advantage, use the data that you already have, right? To then say, yeah, that's an anomaly. That's weird. We're going to dig a little deeper. We're going to find out why that data point exists. And we're going to check it. Okay, confirmed. Yeah, that's just a false positive. We're fine, move on. Or hang on a second, that's suspicious. That's probably a security incident. We're going to raise the alarm. And we're going to call in some of the experts to take a look at this. And last but not least, right, make sure that this is a full circle. Like, we understand that you can create some of this information internally. You can generate your own IOCs, but think about the large group as a whole. We see a lot of security researchers, ISACs, even government agencies share some of its intelligence, right? After they've correlated, curated the data that they have. If you find a brand new attack, please, please, please share that intel, create the IOCs, create the Sigma and Java rules, and share them. If you're already adhering to Sticks and Taxi, create the Sticks notification and have that sent out. That said, I hope this talk has been very meaningful for you. I know threat hunting is difficult for most organizations, but like I said, you can start at a very foundational level, looking at very simple things to start, and then building up from there. That said, I will open it up to for questions and answers.
Fantastic. Thanks, Neumann. Any questions? Feel free to unmute, talk, or put them in the chat.
Hey, Neumann, a question for you. So is your baseline or your most essential hunt tool would be a SIM of some kind? And would you recommend any?
I always recommend having a SIM because the SIM is your single source of data for most organizations, right? Data collection is important, not just from a technical perspective, security perspective, but it's also from a regulatory perspective, right? So the Privacy Commissioner does say that you need at least 2 years worth of logs if they do decide to audit or investigate. Mm-hmm. So a SIM meets all of those requirements. That said, I've seen other, like I said, I've seen other, companies that don't have a SIM, but they have a data collector, which works just as well. Problem with the data collector is how are you analyzing the data?
Right.
So a SIM would be able to help you out with that because they already have all of that logic built into place, especially one that will allow you to run queries, to do searches, to bring in some of the add-ons that will give you the ability to do an entropy search, for example. That really helps. So yes, collecting data is great, but you run into the problem of having too much data and it's useless because it's not intelligence, right? You need to curate that data into intelligence. So I do recommend a SIM. I would say that if you have one already, take a look at what its capabilities are, understand how you can take that data, the data sets that are already in there, and how can you generate some good intelligence out of it.
Yeah, and some of these SIMs too, they come with like they're updated, fairly often with pattern threat detection and that type of stuff. Is that correct?
Some of them come with some things that are fairly I mean, it's rudimentary, it's basic. They're already baked in there. You need to take a look at what is already there and then basically expand it from there. Because like I said, any SIM out there, doesn't matter what the vendor is, they're going to provide you with some very basic queries. It's not specific to your organization. They don't know your organization. Right. So they can't tell you if Bob, is part of the IT group or part of engineering or part of marketing. And if so, they don't know what his behaviors are. It's impossible for them to write a use case for that. But you can, your team can. So that's your home team advantage.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
There's a question in the chat. Can you share an example of the most recent threat hunt conducted?
Yes, the most recent ones that we do, we look for Conti. We look for Conti is actually quite large because most threat actors share infrastructure. So we did notice that there are a lot of similarities, almost to a T with TrickBot. So yeah, so those are the interesting ones.
Any other questions?
Hey Neumann, it's Tanya.
Hey Tanya.
Hello, long time no talk. What would you say to people who want to start threat hunting but have limited resources? Like in terms of is doing threat hunting in terms of priority and prioritization?
Okay, so if you need to prioritize, take a look at the IOC hunts. Just the standard IOC hunts are the easiest ones you can do right away. But obviously go through the framework go through the methodology and see if those IOCs are applicable. Can you hunt those IOCs in your environment, right? It's very often where I go into an organization, they would take the IOCs and put it into a defense. It's not the same as hunting. That's my disclaimer. It's not the same as hunting. So you will need to do a query to see if any of those file hashes, IP addresses, domains have a hit in your data set.
Okay. I guess maybe I'm asking more on a higher level in terms of, I guess you touched on establishing foundations and that threat hunting is more of a thing when your organization is at a more mature level.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess if people or other staff want to tackle threat hunting, but those foundations aren't yet established.
Oh, so say you're kind of in the infancy of your threat hunting model. So you don't really have good visibility. I would say get back to the foundations first. Try to shore that up. You can try to go through the methodology because what the methodology is going to highlight for you is where you may have those gaps. So say, for example, you take a look at an IOC. So it's a bunch of IP addresses. Great. I'm going to take those IP addresses and apply it to the network. Can I look for all activity on the network that will match those IP addresses? Absolutely. Your firewall should be able to say, yes, I can do that. Now you're going to take that, all those IP addresses, and put it into the host space. Can you collect host information that will match IP addresses? Probably not, because most internal networks are not monitored. However, if you have an EDR agent that does check network communications or network connections, then you have data set that you can then match and try to query, right? So that will help you at the very least. So if you go down the methodology and you come to a point where it says, oh, hang on, my internal network is not monitored. I can't tell what IP addresses are inside of or reaching out to a host other than when it crosses the firewall at the perimeter level, then you realize you have a gap. So if anything, even going down the threat hunting model will highlight some of your gaps for you. So it's still a worthwhile activity to start, even if you don't meet all the requirements.
That's great. Thanks.
Okay, well, I think I'll take this opportunity to say, Neumann, thank you very, very much. Oh, sorry. Oh, no, I went too fast here. Adam's got another question. Based on your answer, does the more refined the data source, okay, sorry, I take it, Adam, you mean the better the refined data source, the more easy it is the threat hunt, I think is what you're asking, right?
So the answer to that is it depends. So refined in what way, right? So I've seen a lot of organizations that collect pretty much everything under the sun, which is great. Don't get me wrong. It's better to have options than to have none, right? So in this particular case, it's good to have the granularity of that data set. Problem is this, I find a lot of the times companies see so much data, they get overwhelmed by it, they have no idea how to process it. That's the problem that we run into today. So how do you get around that problem? Yes, it's good to have a lot of data sources. It will make, ultimately at the end of the day, make the hunt easier because you have options to look for. But you need to then curate that data. So does this data make sense for you, right? For your organization? If you don't have a dev shop, you don't have to worry about all the different binaries and .NET frameworks because those things typically will stick out like a sore thumb. Those are easy detections right off the bat. However, if you do, then it becomes a much harder and more challenging engagement. So yes, I unfortunately, the answer for this one is it depends. But it's good to have the option, but just keep in mind that the option also causes problems. Too much data is a problem. You want to quickly convert data into intelligence.
Okay. I think with that, maybe, yeah, excellent. Same. I will echo many of the sentiments in the chat. Newman, great presentation. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this and for coming on board. And excited to have you back in the Vancouver area. And with that, I think I will close off the last meeting of 2021, and hope to see everybody in 2022. And wish everybody a very safe and happy holidays. And take care, everyone. Thank you so much for showing up. Newman, again, great presentation. Thanks, bud.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks.